Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. One of the primary questions that I get from all of you is, when will the craziness be over? And I am wondering that myself. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to our next guest, George Packer, who has a really extensive piece in The Atlantic earlier in the summer called "What Will Become of American Civilization? Conspiracism and Hyperpartisanship in the Nation's Fastest Growing City." We're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about a book that he wrote several years ago that was really eye-opening for me, called The Unwinding: An Inner History of the New America, New York Times bestseller and winner of the 2013 National Book Award. He saw some things coming that I think we can see all around us right now. He's also written The Assassin's Gate: America in Iraq, Blood of the Liberals, which was the winner of the 2001 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. And he's the author of 2 novels and a play, Betrayed, which is the winner of many awards. He's the editor of a 2-volume edition of the Essays of George Orwell and a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer for his Richard Holbrooke biography, Our Man. So this is somebody who does not have a lot of spare time. And so I'm really grateful for your being with us today, George Packer.
It's my pleasure evermore.
I'm wondering, suppose we get to Election Day, and we have a 269 to 269 tie in the Electoral College, with a lot of questions back and forth about whether everything was on the up and up. Given what you've reported about where American society is right now, what happens?
I feel as if we are in a somewhat schizophrenic state of mind, because on the one hand, I spent quite a bit of time in the Metro Phoenix area for that Atlantic cover story you mentioned. It's 25,000 words about what's becoming of the country as seen through the lens of this fast-growing metropolis of Phoenix. And I can't tell you how many people said to me, I'm so tired of the extremes. I'm so tired of the division and the polarization. I just want a leader who brings us together so we can solve the problems we have in common, whether it's water and air or jobs or our children's education. So that was a not just standard, but passionately repeated line I heard again and again. And on the other hand, Phoenix is also the epicenter of a great deal of fever about politics, feverish conspiracy theories, election denialism, MAGA extremism, and potential violence. I mean, there were a lot of armed people standing outside the election counting center in 2020 when Trump was pushing to have the results in Arizona overturned, pushing local political figures, political leaders like Rusty Bowers, Speaker of the Arizona House, to throw out the results and give him his own electors. So how do you reconcile those two things, where so many people just desperately want to get out of the nightmare that we've been in for many years now, and yet every election we walk up right to the edge of violence and then in some cases cross it, like on January 6th, 2021. This year there have been, it seems, 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump and all kinds of threats against Kamala Harris. There's been rhetoric against immigrants in Ohio and across the country, not just from local crazies, but from the leading figures in the Republican Party that I think are incredibly provocative, and incendiary, almost certain to lead to some kind of violence if there's a charge that illegal immigrants threw the election to Harrison walls, which seems to be what is being set up. And I don't know how the overwhelming exhaustion and desire for a better republic on the part of, I think, the majority is going to be able to restrain the the boiling rage that we see, especially on the right, that's not just exploited but stirred up, deliberately caused by leaders in politics, in media, in culture who are benefiting from it and thrive on it. So I'm really worried that if the scenario you just described comes to pass, we will see violence. And once it starts, it really is difficult to say how it's going to be put back.
When you were spending time in Phoenix working on this piece and over the past several years as you're looking at this in a broader sense, how do you explain why it is that it really does seem to be that the majority of people really don't want to be in this situation, really don't want to be divided in their families or in their neighborhoods. And yet those people seem to be absent when it comes to making the decisions. Why does that happen?
They don't have the loudest voices. They're quiet. They don't have platforms because it isn't profitable, it seems, to say, can we all calm down and back off and, for God's sake, come to our senses before something terrible happens? That just isn't a moneymaker. And it's not a clickbaiter. And that in that sense, we're all to blame if we go on social media and start scrolling through provocative posts. It's addictive. It's sort of temporarily exciting. I find it then kind of depressing once you have done it for a few minutes. But we are being fed this kind of toxic candy by tech giants and the people who own them, and by the big voices on them who tend to be the most extreme and loud voices. So that's what we hear. It's also right now who is in charge of the Republican Party. The people in charge of the party who are controlling the convention, the nomination process, the donors, the media, want to raise the temperature. It's how they've achieved and maintained power. And so there have been some figures like you and David French and others who have tried to provide a counterweight. And it, as much as I admire it, it just hasn't gotten very far because that's not where the center of gravity of the party is right now, at least at the top levels where people have power and influence. And they've used it to crush dissenting voices and to make sure that only the most extreme and loyal voices are heard and are considered real faithful in the party. And I don't see an answer to that except for an overwhelming defeat, and maybe even several overwhelming defeats, because it's been profitable, and so it'll continue to be the rhetoric and the practice of the party until it's no longer profitable.
There are some people who will ask me, how much can a single person really do? So there are some people who will look at maybe they have a family member or a friend who's become involved in some of the conspiracy theories that you write about in the piece, or some of the hyper partisanship on either the right or the left. And they're trying to maintain a relationship. They're trying to remain connected. But at the same time, they're saying, am I contributing to the problem by avoiding these sorts of conversations? Or am I going to make them worse if I'm trying to depoliticize some of those things, like being family members and friends?
In other words, should I engage on this or should I avoid it in order to maintain a decent relationship, right? I was asked just that question at a talk I gave in Houston the other day by a woman whose father she loves and whose father has become a QAnon believer. What I said to her was, you have to talk to him about it, but if talking to him about it makes a relationship impossible and you still want the relationship is more important. than
Mhm.
trying to convince your father that this is a fantasy. Fortunately, I have not had to face that in my own life, so I can't give a personal answer. But what I have done as a journalist is sought out people who politically I don't agree with on purpose. I did that in Phoenix. I went to the Turning Point USA convention that Charlie Kirk runs and
Mhm.
talked to a bunch of people there and found that, except for Charlie Kirk himself, every one of them was quite decent about it. I had my
Mm.
Atlantic badge around my neck, and they didn't start calling me names and telling me to get out of there. They seemed to be glad that I was there and was interested in hearing from them. And most people I find are capable of having a civil conversation across a deep disagreement. And if you truly are listening and trying to understand, they, as a journalist, it's necessary for me to get people to talk to me. And I find that I usually can. And I did with people at that convention and with a gentleman whose wife had died a couple of years earlier, probably of COVID, although he is not so sure, and who has quite a strong Trump supporter, but who's also just a kind and decent man, someone that I like talking to. And at the end of that conversation, I had to say to myself, I don't have the answer. The question is, how can a good person be for Trump? A kind of basic moral question. How can a decent, good person be for Trump? I put it to him directly. How can you, a decent person, be for Trump? And he had lots of reasons. And I had to admit to myself at the end of the interview, I don't have an answer. He has his reasons. They don't make sense to me based on my idea of what leadership and morality and democracy are about. But we still had the conversation and we continue to have. So it's possible. I don't know how much is gained from that. Some people have told me, why do you bother? Some of my fellow journalists don't bother. They sit in a bubble, reading and writing on Twitter and essentially playing to their own team. And that I find part of the problem. And I've been trying to get away from it, which is why I wrote The Unwinding and have written a lot of other things. Whether it does any more than talking to your wayward uncle, I don't know. But I don't know what else to do because we're human beings. And I don't want our humanity and our common life here in America to be utterly impossible across a political divide. That is a future that is too grim for me and too grim to think about for my children.
Do you suppose the man at the Turning Point USA event would be asking in his own mind, how could someone not be for Trump? I mean, I imagine he has deep concerns about immigration and about some of the things going on in the court system and those kinds of things. Uh, he probably was asking, how can a good moral person not be for this? Or do you think he was already there? Could he have that imaginative tie?
I don't think he was asking himself that question because for him, this morality had been put aside. He said to me, I don't want Trump to tell me how to raise my children. I don't want him to
Mm.
tell me how to run a business. I don't want him to tell me how to be a good person. But as he put it, I would grab her by the whatever if he stops the border crossings and gets us out of foreign wars and ends onerous regulations, etc. The policy matters. The policy
Mm.
matters for him were supreme. And that meant he didn't really need to think about Trump as a moral figure. Whereas I said to him, and I would say to you, it's impossible not to. He wants to be our leader again. And what he has done as an utterly malignant and immoral human being is to bring the entire country down closer to his level in so many ways, which have real effects in people's lives. So I can't separate them, but he did. And that's why I don't think for him, it was a mystery how a decent person could be against Trump. The way to me, it's a mystery how a decent person can be for him.
I imagine, I can't say for certain, but I imagine probably this guy, if you were to go back in a time machine to, say, 2004, probably would have been upset about the Dixie Chicks criticizing George W.
Hmm.
Bush, probably would have been really hawkish on Al Qaeda and on Iraq. And now those sorts of categories seem to have been all upended. How much of this fragile moment do you think came about because of things such as the Iraq War? Or is that just incidental? Is it just sort of everybody's following the leader, or was there a kind of disillusionment that came from those things?
It's not incidental in my view. I think it's part of the sequence, part of the genealogy that led to Trump and the unwinding, which ends short of Trump. I wrote it between 2009 and 2013. It nonetheless anticipates someone like Trump just by showing the landscape that he exploited. The Iraq War was, which I covered for the New Yorker at the time, was incredibly bitter and disillusioning, especially to people who from military families, family members of people who serve, maybe people who died. But I think right after the disaster in Iraq came the disaster of the financial crisis and the Great Recession
Hmm.
and the housing collapse. And I covered that too. And that was really the substance of much of the unwinding. That was also incredibly cynical making. The government is bailing out these giant multinational banks while homeowners are being left to drown underwater. Unemployment is remaining stubbornly high. There don't seem to be all that many jobs being created by all this spending. And it's not hard to understand how people could have come to the conclusion that the elites have it all rigged for their own benefit. The people are getting screwed, and the middle class is disappearing. It's something I heard over and over. Our children will not have as good a life as we had. That
Hmm.
became just a recurring mantra, just as today the recurring mantra is, I'm so tired of the extremism. Well, 15 years
Hmm.
ago, the beginning of the extremism was apparent. The Tea Party was part of it. I'd say Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter on the left became progressive, not quite mirror images, but a place where progressives could express their disillusionment, their cynicism about the same institutions in some cases that the right felt that way about, whether it was banks or government or major corporations, the loss of jobs overseas, all of that, which had been going on for decades, of course, kind of came to a head
Hmm.
in those years of Iraq and the financial crisis. And I interviewed Peter Thiel, the billionaire entrepreneur for The Unwinding, and he told me a story, which was that Mitt Romney had come to him to raise money in 2012 when Romney ran against Obama. And Thiel asked Romney, well, what's your message going to be? And Romney's message was, if we just could get rid of Obama, we could be a great country. And Thiel thought to himself, that's not going to do it because people are so negative about the state of the country that they're not going to believe that. What might convince them is someone who says the country is in a terrible state because it's been sold out by all of its leader class, not just the Democrats. Well, that became Donald Trump's message, and he rode to the White House on it. So between 2005 and 2016, a tremendous disillusionment with the great truisms of American life took over in the minds of a lot of people. Things are not getting better. Things will not get better. College may be a hoax, not the answer to our families' desires. And immigration is not making the country more energetic and prosperous. Immigration is taking away our jobs and our way of life, things like that. So the negativity
Hmm.
came out of that period and it's kind of continued up until the present.
There's a raging debate going on at a university in the state where I live right now about Mike Pence coming as a speaker. And in this case, it's not sort of the January 6th constituency coming after him, but the far left. And the argument is it's not safe to hear someone whose viewpoint is this dangerous, quote unquote. So he shouldn't be platformed. He shouldn't be allowed to speak. Nothing has broken out the way that we've seen on some campuses where speakers are not physically allowed to speak at all because they're being heckled down. But some of the arguments that would come out of that extreme younger left would be very similar to what you're saying. We can't afford a house the way that our parents could or our grandparents could. We're not going to be able to have a middle class life. So you almost have some of the same frustrations just being expressed in a completely opposite way.
I would say the word that describes both that extreme left and right is illiberal, in the sense that the liberal values that I think are essential to democracy. Democracy is not just about elections, it's about free speech, it's about freedom of worship, it's about due process, pluralism, accepting differences, certain amount of tolerance, a certain amount of willingness to compromise, not to insist on a total solution that is what I want. That describes the left and the right today. The one difference, though, is the left would never say "Make America Great Again," because in that ideology, there's a kind of original sin that has poisoned the country from the very start. Slavery. Yes,
1619
slavery
project.
and
Yeah.
of course, Indian genocide. And although those two atrocities needed to be brought to the surface, they had kind of been buried. Certainly when I was a child in my education, that's not what the story of American history that I learned. So in that sense, 1619 and other academic and journalistic efforts were necessary. But what they've done is sort of put a dead hand on our history, as if to say we can never be anything else. We never have been, we never will be. There's a sort of a fatalism and pessimism that I think is both politically a dead end. It doesn't seem to have any ability to move large numbers of people to vote, to act, to organize. And it's also philosophically wrong. So I think the left has gone down a dead end street. It's a little less crazy and delusional than the right's dead end street. In fact, I'd say a good deal less. But they do mirror each other in the way you're saying, in the sense that they both lost faith in the basic optimistic and core principles of the founding and of American history as it's sort of been handed down from one generation to the next.
Yeah, when I was thinking about the conversation you mentioned between Mitt Romney and Peter Thiel, I immediately thought, at the time, it would have sounded like Romney had the better and more obvious case, at least politically. If you think of Reagan in 84, Morning in America, or even Ford in 76, I'm feeling good about America, or 2008, Obama, hope.
Yeah, or Bill Clinton, the bridge to the 21st century, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah. That seems to have worked for a long time, and now we have groups who may have nothing else in common except for the fact that they kind of see America as being in this dark dystopian sort of place for different reasons. Is that cyclical? So does that eventually get replaced by a better feeling, or is this a new era?
That is a really important question. I don't have a glib and easy answer for you because I can't predict the future and never want to try. I do think undeniably America has turned downward in its worldwide influence, in its ability to create an economy that really benefits the majority, and in its ability to convince each generation that it has a place here and that place can get better and better. I don't think we do that anymore. I think if you look at us as a world power, every world power has an apogee, a kind of zenith in the sun, and then it has a period of decline. Britain's came after World War II, and I think ours has happened. I think the Iraq War had a lot to do with it. Doesn't mean we're in eclipse and have no ability to move the world for better or worse, but we made serious mistakes. We squandered things. And as a result, we're living more and more in a world in which countries are looking to China, Russia, and other systems. We're in an era of democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. And some very smart people compare it to the 1930s. I don't go that far because I don't see a genocidal megalomaniac at the helm of a really powerful country who is intent on that level of destruction. But it's certainly true that autocracy is on the rise, and that it's on the rise here in America too. And the proof is that Donald Trump is running for president for the third time and may well win for the second time. And who knows, we can talk about this, what he might do if he does win. So I was just talking to my just turned 17-year-old son and his friend about this yesterday. And I said, what makes you hopeful?
Mm-hmm.
And they took a while to answer. And they said, nothing with politics. We just want to stay away from politics. They both are musicians, so they said music. My son said scientific progress in things like medicine. And then he said, but I don't like to think about the future because it looks not just like there's political trouble, but like there's giant forces kind of bearing down on his generation, whether it's climate change or the prospect of nuclear war or some huge economic upheaval, or even technology replacing us or reducing us in some ways to handmaidens of machines. His generation, I think, is pretty pessimistic. So I don't think it's going to change in 5 years. I don't think the cycle will be that fast. We will enter some other era that looks different and where there are different expectations and values, perhaps.
What about religion? I was looking through my copy of The Unwinding from before and noticing where I had made highlights and notes when I read it first time when it first came out. And very early in the book, you talk about a religious person, a Bob Jones University graduate, going through some time of disillusionment. Where does religion fit in your vantage point right now? In terms of trying to address that sense of hopefulness or tragedy? Does secularization cause some of this? Is it a result of some of this? How do we understand religion?
Well, you're asking a person who has none and who has tried at different kind of crisis times in my life to find it. And I never have. And I don't think I ever will. They say no one is an atheist in a foxhole. I've been in a couple of little mini foxholes, but the big one, which is the approach of death, I fortunately have not faced yet. So we'll see. So it's hard for me to answer. I fundamentally have no deep empathy with religion. It's alien to me. People begin telling me of the principles of their faith. And once it gets past do unto others as you would have others do unto you, it begins to seem like a fairy tale to me. And so I begin to tune, it almost causes my brain just to tune out a little bit because it doesn't make sense. As a social and political force, it's always as positive or negative as the people who follow the faith. It's inseparable. I don't think any faith in itself has the ability to make us better or worse. People do with it what they will. And Christianity has been for 2,000 years, a great philosophy of the dignity of the human individual. Now, if I had a religion, that would be my religion, full stop. it wouldn't go any farther than that. But it's also been a force of intolerance and war and bigotry and destruction. And there's a bit of that going on right now in this country with Christian nationalism. So I don't see I don't see it as either an inherently good or bad thing for our society. I see it as a reflection of the moral and political condition of our society. And right now, I would say Christianity has a lot to answer for in America. It's being used for a lot of purposes that I think are negative, just as I think Islam has a lot to answer for in a great deal of the world. And in Israel, I think Judaism has a lot to answer for. So in other words, if we're looking at its principles and its words and its scripture, I want to know, well, what are you actually doing in your life? And then I'll judge it. I think David French has written something like this. He pays less attention now to what people say about their faith than what they actually do. And I'm a huge fan of David French, and I think that that's the right way to see it. Is secularization making us a more vulgar, divisive, uncaring society? I just can't say that that's true because I see vulgarity and divisiveness and lack of caring on both sides.
What I mean by that is if you look at a couple of forces going on at once, one of them being the disconnect between the elites and others. When you have a sense of not understanding each other's worlds at all. And then you add to that the fact that you have church attendance dropping, which even for people who don't have a religious faith or a religious background, it's part of a larger trend of communities splintering apart. So you have even lonelier people who may consider themselves to be Christians, may have a religion, but they're not in a community of other people. Right. And it seems to me that continues to pull at the unwinding that we're already experiencing.
That's true. And you mentioned one of the characters in The Unwinding, Dean Price, who grew up in Western North Carolina in an extremely religious community and family, and who remains a Christian, but who became alienated from his father and from the church of his father, from Bob Jones University, where he went to school for 1 year before leaving, and from the sense of that it was repressive and bigoted. That was what he couldn't tolerate about the Christianity around him. He didn't have a church. He was a lone believer. And there was another character in Youngstown, Ohio, a Black woman who had worked on an assembly line, also Christian, also had kind of become a lonely believer. She eventually found a church that she quite liked, but for a while, there was a sense of loneliness in everyone I wrote about. A lack of connection to community, to institutions, and certainly to the country. And is that a phenomenon of faith or secularization, or is it a phenomenon of modern post-industrial capitalism or of our technological revolutions? I don't know. It's all of that. But it is profound, and I saw it 15 years ago, and I think it's only gotten more pronounced since then. And how to rebuild community is a big, big question. And I think what I found in writing that book was you have to begin in a very small place. You have to begin in your own community with a project that isn't ending climate change, but is something more like getting farmers to grow canola in order to make biodiesel, which is what Dean Price was doing.
And how would somebody even begin to do that, though? Because I think you're right. If you're talking about something as huge as climate change or even polarization, this is too big for people to think they can do anything, and they just assume, well, this is just the way that things are. Yeah. But they can collaborate and work together on a more local level. But I think there are a lot of people who would say, I don't even know how to start that.
Well, I have a very tired idea that is not my own, but that I still think is important, which is national service. I think if every 18, 19, 20-year-old American were required regardless of where you are in school or in life, to spend a year working in national parks, working in cities, serving in the military, working in some civilian or military capacity with other, the key is with other Americans your age from backgrounds you would, that have nothing in common with yours. So you have a kid from some rural area outside of Nashville and another kid from the Bronx and another kid from Seattle working together on, I don't know, helping the homeless or helping with the effects of climate change on a community or building dams or building bridges. I sometimes think what we really need is something like what Bosnia had after their civil war, where they had international organizations coming in and overseeing Serbs and Bosnians working together on bridge building or on a production of a play, so that they just had to work together. And maybe we need the intervention, the oversight of others, because we don't know how to do it ourselves. I'm being a bit facetious, but I think that experience, which during the years of the draft, Americans had much more often than they do now. Someone from a very educated and well-off background just had to spend time with someone who hadn't finished high school because they were in the Army together. It's not going to be the Army today, or not that alone, but simply having that experience, I don't think will make them hate each other more. I think at the end of that year, they're going to begin to understand each other a little bit better.
Would you make that mandatory?
Yeah, absolutely. Will it happen? It's been talked about for a long time. I'm sure there are all kinds of lobbies and political interests that would fight it like hell. But if I had a magic wand to do one thing to lessen the polarization, that would be it.
I'm sure you've seen The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt's new book,
Sure.
and other research talking about mental health crises for really the younger we go, the more that's the case. Some of them even suggesting that there are gender disparities, more the case with young women than young men, more with people on the political left than on the political right in terms of anxiety, at least. And I think about what you wrote about at the very beginning of The Unwinding, where you talked about a sense of too much freedom in one way, leading to this kind of vertigo that people are experiencing. How do we turn that around when it seems that technology is just going to continue? The kinds of social pressures that we have are going to continue. So how does the 17-year-old friend of your son's that was there, who wants to live a healthy, flourishing life, but can't see how to do it? What do we do?
Well, I would start with John Haidt, who's a friend, and taking phones out of kids' hands in school is a great beginning. My kids pretty much have gone through years of schooling, middle school, high school, where no one took a phone out of their hands. And although I understand why parents and kids are reluctant to lose them, I think it would have been good. And I've probably not been altogether a roaring success as a parent when it comes to technology. But you just have the feeling that an entire society is against you. You're just against this giant tide of technological change. They need to be in touch with their friends. You don't want your kid to be isolated and a kind of eccentric outsider because their parents won't let them have a phone. But that's a place to start. And if we all do it at the same time, then our kids won't be the weirdos. They'll be like the other kids, and there'll be periods with them and periods without them. I personally find the smartphone to be a kind of convenient tyrant that I keep in my pocket of my own free will, and yet find loathsome and I resent it most of the time. And so I wish we could unwind the clock or rewind it and go back to when the smartphone era started and do it differently. Maybe go back to when the internet started and do it differently. I think that's a big part of what plagues young people. Although my children will tell you it's not just the phones, it's the world. And they have a point. The phones, they sort of feel like we're blaming them for letting themselves get hooked on them, when in fact, maybe they're hooked on them because they don't want to think about the world all the time. But I think Height is right that kids need less parental pressure and less parental worrying and helicoptering around them. They need to be allowed to find their own way. Right now, our older child is about to apply to college, and I'm just seeing in him, as I've seen in many of his peers, my friends' children, just a tremendous amount of pressure sets in. This is for a certain class of Americans who are what you might call the meritocratic elites, the professionals who see the school their kid ends up in as being the key to the success of their child's life almost. And it's just way too much pressure. It's absurd because, of course, life doesn't work that way. It has all kinds of surprises and detours and circuitous routes to a good end. But we've given them the idea that they have to become these inauthentic selves who put together a preposterous application package that includes founding, nonprofits and doing 25 after school activities. And it seems it's unhealthy. And that is a deep flaw in the elite. It's not something you see among most Americans, but those who are going to be the leaders and who are grooming the next generation of leaders, I think are creating a class of aristocrats, essentially, meritocratic aristocrats who are separate from the rest of society and don't see the rest of society's problems and concerns because they've been living such different lives, all on the track of success. So that's a little speech for you about something that troubles me a great deal about my own class, my own world.
Last question. You mentioned earlier that you're a secular person, no religious affiliation, and that you've tried the foxhole a time or two. If you were to look for, what would it take to convince you that there is a God? I mean, what sort of evidence would you be looking for if you were to think this through? What would it take to show you that, do you think?
I guess it depends on if you're asking about a personal God with whom I actually feel I have a relationship.
Yeah.
Or whether I feel there's a creative force in the universe, whether I feel there's some kind of spiritual realm that is unseen and inhabits, living things or all created things, but that I'd be a little closer to being able to imagine the latter. Although I might even then say, Edmund Wilson once said, you're taking away my rights, because that's not religion. You can't say I'm religious if I just believe that there's some kind of beauty to the stars. A personal relationship, I would have to hear from him or her. I would have to feel as if I'm being spoken to. And I look up at the sky, and for me, the sky is empty. It's a beautiful sky, but it's empty. It doesn't offer meaning to me. It doesn't offer a structure for belief. It's matter. So where does meaning come from? From within me and my relationships with other human beings. I'm a humanist, Reverend Moore. I believe in the potential greatness and the centrality of human beings. And I believe in the philosophy that nothing human is foreign to me. I was actually in France with my family a few weeks ago, and we went to the chateau of the great French essayist Montaigne. And he built himself a tower in the 16th century as like a study. And on the top floor is his library. It's a circular room with his desk in it. And on the beams, he had carved some of his favorite Latin and Greek quotations. And one of them, which I learned in school, is "Homos ame alienum nihil humani puto." I am a human being. I consider nothing human foreign to me. That's my religion. I don't know if it makes sense to you as a faith or as just a philosophy or a way of living. But when I saw that on that beam, I thought, kind of a shiver went through me. Like 500 years ago, someone sat in this study writing great essays with the same philosophy that I have. So it almost might be like you coming upon a piece of scripture in some very unlikely place.
And having worked and seen sort of the unwinding dark side of human nature, that doesn't shake your belief in humanity?
It's shaken every day. It's shaken every day. And at times I look at what we do, we human beings, and think I'd rather hang out with my dog, who seems a lot nicer and certainly doesn't invent stories about dogs eating people. But I can't really give up on humanity because it's what we are, and because we've done a lot of good things, a lot of amazing things, and it's my children's future too. That's the big thing for me these days. I can't give up on them. So it's almost like, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. I believe in humanity. Help me when I find us to be ridiculous.
George Packer, staff writer at The Atlantic, author of The Unwinding, an Inner History of the New America. Thank you for being with us.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
We'll be right back. George Packer really had some interesting insights about what he sees as the roots of kind of why we see the unwinding that we see around us. I was really fascinated to hear his talking about his unbelief in God. And the reason why I asked him at the end if he's not shaken by his belief in humanity as all that there is because it seems to me that would not be enough to keep trying to rewind in the literal sense to put back together the world around us, especially when he said he looks at the stars and he sees a dead universe, he sees dead matter. I wonder if that can really hold without some cognitive dissonance. And I know he would say, for those of us who do have faith and belief in God, why are we not shaken? And a lot of us are, with some of the things that we've seen done in the name of religion. And yet we also have seen the fact that Jesus, the one that we believe, not only knows what he's talking about, but is the truth, the way, and the life, has prepared us for those things and warned us about those things. So I kept thinking about a figure completely different from George Packer in all of these concerns about humanity almost. And that's Ayn Rand. I came across an interview with Ayn Rand from sometime in the 1970s. It was posted on YouTube. And the interviewer asked her, Phil Donahue asked her, when you look up into the stars as an atheist, what do you see? And she said, nothing. And the interviewer said, does that not cause you to have a sense of wonder when you see this? And she said, no, that what caused her a sense of wonder is to see skyscrapers, because she saw human ingenuity and human activity there. She would be completely different than George Packer when it comes to these questions of empathy, for instance. She said that altruism is itself immoral and had a view of the self as the focus, where he is having a focus on his children, on the future. And so it would really be interesting to have an ongoing conversation about whether the kind of longing for something to be, someone to be out there who is personal, who does love us. If C.S. Lewis isn't onto something when he argues that longing itself points us somewhere, I think it does, and I think it points us to someone. But George Packer has done a good service, whether you agree with him or disagree with him. He has seen some of the fracturing and some of the divides, and he's been seeing it for a long time. Let's hope that we see it go the other way. This is Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Producer, Will Dawson. Associate producers, Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.